In today's episode, we examine the final phase of the Battle of Berlin as Soviet troops conquer the city and Hitler meets his end.
Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hi, Jesse. Here again, another week, another podcast. I think this is now episode, I don't even know, 6 or 7 or 10 or 100 of the Battle of Berlin. We did say that we're going.
You be the judge.
We did say we're going to take a little bit of time and you listeners and viewers make you listen and watch all of this, because Berlin is one of the central episode stories of the war. This is where you might say, even though it's technically not 100% right, but the war comes to an end. And it's a fascinating story, fascinating episode of that war in all its facets, mainly negative ones, to be perfectly honest. But that's why we wanted to devote some time and effort to the whole thing. And I think we've kind of nearly done it now. We've nearly cracked it. I shouldn't be saying this probably because, well, we said before we started recording we're going to have one more episode, but let's see how it goes. You know us.
No,
we've got another 4.
It has to be
there
one.
We go. Where are we at, Jesse? Where are we at
right
now in this final piece of the story? What have we done so far? Where do we need to go from here?
All right, folks. We've reached the point of high drama, right, where Berlin is going to fall in this episode. What we've done in the previous
Berlin bleibt Deutsch.
Well, that was spray painted on some walls, but that didn't help them.
No.
In any case, over the previous episodes in this series, we've taken you from the planning for the Berlin operation all the way through the initial breakthroughs at Seelow Heights, for example, east of Berlin, to the pursuit phase where Berlin is finally then encircled on April 25th, to the destruction of the extra halbe pocket of surrounded German troops outside Berlin, to all the preparations and the character of the urban warfare that's going to be happening in Berlin. So the city landscape with its ruins, with its canals and rivers, with its built-up areas, with its rail infrastructure, all these are going to play a role in some of the fighting that we'll get into the details of today. We talked about who's there. So the Soviets have these 2 big army groups that are entering the city under Zhukov and Konev. The Germans are in complete and utter disarray. They have mixed units, exhausted units, thrown together units. They have teenagers. They have old men. They have confusion between the military and the political side, between different military commanders. It is a total mess. What that means on the ground, how the fighting progresses, that's what we're going to take you all through today until then the end of the whole thing on May 2nd, 1945. So, Matthias, I think it makes sense. We talked about this a little bit off air. It doesn't make sense to try to reconstruct the whole battle block by block. We'd be doing another 10 episodes, and it would be as painful as the original thing. So I think to help all of you guys out there get a better idea of what the fighting is like, what are some of the important milestones in the battle, it makes sense to take a few examples and sort of go through those. So Matthias, do you want to throw your hat in the ring and get the ball rolling?
Yes, okay. So we talked about the structure of the defensive layer, you might say, the defensive cake of Berlin. And it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about the most outward line of defense, because there was no fighting there. The Soviets just rode through into the suburbs of Berlin. That's also quite interesting because Berlin is a big city. So while you have the fighting for the center of Berlin, the suburbs, particularly the east, you already have, well, I wouldn't call it proper peace, but there is no fighting anymore, at least. And the Soviets have taken over and trying to get normal life back up and running. So again, because it's such a big place, we need to look at these things as well. There are different aspects and different facets to different areas of Berlin. So it probably makes sense to concentrate on where the Germans start the real defense, and that is along this S-Bahn ring. So it's basically the second line of German defense. You mentioned there are numerous examples. 2 or 3 perhaps we should mention. The first one is, just because the names are also famous, the first one might be Tempelhof. If you know anything about Berlin, Tempelhof, of course, is one of the big 3 airports that Berlin used to have. At that particular stage, it's supposed to become the big new airport. I'll give you a little bit of a story. So it opens in the 1920s. Before that, you've got airports in other places on the outskirts of Berlin. This is then built. A lot of people always say it was all Albert Speer, Hitler's famous architect, who got involved. It wasn't all him, but he's also involved. But we don't need to do architectural history. You might have seen the building of the Tempelhof terminal, which in those days when it was built was the largest and biggest building in the world. Interesting thing is that from that particular terminal all the way to 1945, not a single plane took off because it was still in the building stage. They took off from the other terminal, basically a wooden hut, so to speak. But what is very interesting about this one is first of all, it borders onto the S-Bahn ring, so this is why it's important. You then, of course, have the airfield, which is a very, very open space, which means it's a very good killing ground. You then have this big building, which was used by the Germans as an armaments factory. A very, very high number, for example, of the Stuka dive bombers is built there, as are the Focke-Wulf 190 at that stage. And there are accounts where while the fighting for Berlin is going on, they just get the planes out of the hangars, fly them into battle, bring them back to service them, and fly them straight back out again. So this is all stuff that you find there. And then, of course, it becomes very famous because of the airlift in the later 1940s, the blockade of Berlin. But this, of course, is a very, very different story. So by the Germans, this area is identified as a very, very good defensive area just because of this killing zone that you have. And this is why they put relatively strong forces there. In the previous episode, we talked about some of these non-German forces they're fighting there. There's some of them as well at the northern perimeter of the airfield. There's some guys from the Nordland division here. And at dawn on the 25th of April, the Soviets then finally attack. This is when they've got to this line. And so if you don't know where Tempelhof is, it's to the southeast of the center of Berlin. And quite close to that, you also have Chuikov's command post, which he takes up. And this is where the Germans can actually also surrender the city of Berlin. But I'm jumping ahead. We're now in early May. But that's it's about a 10-minute walk from the terminal entrance. So not far at all. And not far from there either, if you're interested in German culture, Marlene Dietrich also grew up, the famous German actress. She was from just a few blocks away from where the Germans surrendered in 1945. We can have a complete tangent and talk about the Blue Angel, but I don't think we really need to do that. So that's the general setup. So a very, very open space within this urban desert, you might say, this burnt out shell of Berlin. Of course, the Soviets also know that this is a relatively important place because once you've got across here, you then can march relatively unopposed into the center of Berlin. They throw, of the 8th Guards Army, Chuikov throws in there, and I need to look at my notes, because otherwise I always get this wrong. The first, they throw in the 8th Guard Army and the 1st Tank Army. So in total, for this fighting in this area, the southeastern part of Berlin, that is 3 rifle corps and 4 armored corps across the Teltow Canal, which also runs in this area, to seize the airport. I mean, you just think about this. If you look at this force and the force composition here, I mean, this is absolutely crazy. This is more than what most Western armies would have today and could throw into not only a battle, but a war. And this is the majority of these forces here are used to seize this particular airfield. It's begun the attack by an Army Corps, 28th Guards Rifle Corps, but they also have support from lots of other units, brigades, or whatever. I'm not going to talk you through all the tactical things where the divisions were. But in the end, you end up with 4 divisions launching the direct attack onto the airfield, supported by these other forces, some held in reserve and some going onto the flanks. You then get very, very heavy fighting because the Germans know about the importance of this as well. They managed to hold the Soviets halfway across the airfield because the Germans are able to bring a little bit of indirect fire. They also It doesn't really work anymore. It's a bit too late. They're trying to bring some air in as well, but that's a bit difficult. But artillery fire still comes in, mortar fire comes in. They managed to hold the Soviets in pretty much the center of that the airfield for about a day. But then they're wearing thin. They're getting exhausted. The Soviets bring in more reinforcements from this massive buildup that I've already mentioned. And they then managed to fight their way through and into the terminal building, and the fighting there is then over. It takes about a day and a half. But just again, the sheer size of force that you find on the Soviet side is just absolutely remarkable. We have to be slightly careful. I think we said this before when we talk about Soviet forces. Quite often, they're not as strong as we think. First of all, units and formations are smaller anyway than Western ones, and of course they've been bloodied. They've fought their way through Berlin, so they might look impressive on paper, but in reality they're a little bit weaker. But still, this is proper overwhelming force that the Soviets use here. I mean, I've got one or two other examples from that particular perimeter, but I am conscious that, as always, I'm talking far too long and too much. So, Jesse, I'm throwing it back to you. What have you got on this, or anywhere during the Battle of Berlin?
Well, I think we can introduce the famous/infamous flak towers and their role in the battle. To take one little step back, of course, as the war goes on, there is a need to defend against air attack, and that defense doesn't always work that well, but there's a lot of effort that the Germans put into it. And one of the things that they do in a few cities, in Berlin, in Vienna, and in Hamburg, is they build these absolutely gigantic concrete anti-aircraft towers, flak towers. And each flak tower actually consists of a pair of two. These huge concrete things. One of them is the command tower, so the Leitturm. They're usually the rectangular ones. Well, it depends on the model. Different cities had different ones that looked a little bit different. In Vienna, they're the rectangular ones, and the fighting towers are the round ones in Vienna. I think in Berlin, the fighting towers are also square because they were the original design. In any case, they are huge. They tower above other parts of the city. They're absolutely massive. And they have batteries of 128 millimeter anti-aircraft guns on top of them. Now, that's what you need to take out a 4-engine bomber. But now that the ground fighting has reached Berlin, they're going to play a role there as well, because you can depress those guns, not to fire at the foot of the tower. Obviously, that'd be too much, but you can plot out, where can we hit in the city with this gun if we lower it as much as possible. So they become a factor in the ground fighting. They also become a factor in civilian life, since many civilians take refuge in them. They're so massive, they're so thickly built that you have civilians crowding into the bottom part of them to take shelter from the fighting. So in Berlin, if memory serves, now I'm just doing this off the cuff, there was one in Prenzlauer Berg, Friedrichshain area, I think in the Volkspark, what it is now. There was one at Humboldthain, and there was one other one. Remind me, where was the third one?
Bahnhof Zoo, the train station.
Yes, exactly. In the Zoo Bahnhof. That's the one that can fire towards a very famous bridge that we're going to get to in a moment. So yes, in the Zoo, near the zoo, you have the third set. So these massive things are built starting in 1940, I believe, and they become like permanent fortified fixtures in the fighting in Berlin, and they're very difficult for the Soviets to deal with because you don't really have anything that can crack them open. And so what do you do if there's an impermeable mini fortress? And that causes some complications, Matthias, right? In particular at Humboldthain.
Well, it does. You might say that these three flak towers that you get, they become the cornerstone of the German defense of Berlin. As you already said, we've got these three. So if you're not familiar with Berlin, so Bahnhof Zoo is in the western part of Berlin. Becomes quite famous during the partition of Berlin from the 1940s to all the way to 1989, because you might say that is more or less the center of West Berlin. There you also had an additional tower, and that tower housed the command of the flak division, because we got one flak division designated just to defend Berlin. Then Humboldthain, which is to the northern end of the city center, and Volkspark Friedrichshain, which is in the eastern part of the center. And you already talked about the structures, absolutely huge, absolutely imposing, and they are very well armed and armored, and they can take part in the fighting, and they do, all three of them. And they're actually so big a mess. I'm jumping ahead a little bit before I talk about the events that happened there at Humboldthain, that after the war, the Allies of all sides found it very, very difficult to dismantle them. And when you look at the Berlin landscape, you can still see the remnants of two of them. So the one in Volkspark Friedrichshain in the east, that was just covered in some of the rubble that came of the destroyed cities of Berlin. You can go to this park today. It's in the eastern part. And when you go all the way to the top of that hill, you can still see the end of a huge concrete structure, because the last, let's say, 2 or 3 meters of that bunker were not covered. The rest was covered. This bunker also housed, in addition to all the guns and shelter for the civilians and medical dressing stations and things like this, also housed a lot of the remains and goods from the Berlin museums. Which, strange enough, then after the war found their way to Moscow. So there we are. That's where they are now. The one at the Bahnhof Zoo, first the British, because that's in the British zone of occupation, also tried to cover it up with some rubber. They then realized that didn't really work because it was taking up too much space. They took it all up again. And then they tried to blow it up. And that's quite a funny story, because they tried to blow it up the first time, put lots of explosives in. Some people, I think it's about, 20 tons of explosive, I think. I might have to double check, but somewhere in that region. And they brought out the population of Berlin to show them how British military might is superior to German concrete. And someone pressed the button and there was a loud bang. And after the bang is over and there's lots of smoke, people can see, okay, that bunker is still there exactly the way it had been there before. So that didn't work at all. So they think, we need to do something else. They doubled the amount of explosives in there. Again, they bring out the entire population of Berlin to say, well, look at this now. They go, ka-chung, press the button. Story goes that the entire building lifts up a little bit, comes down, and looks exactly like that as I had done before. So that's slightly embarrassing for the British occupational forces. So what do they do now? Next time, they put, again, explosives in, and more or less in the middle of the night, not telling anybody. They press the button because they're themselves not confident that it's going to be successful. This time it is, but because they haven't told anybody, so everybody left their windows closed, and that means the last few remaining proper windows all over Berlin were then shattered. But that one's gone as well. And then we've got the last one, that's Humboldthain. And that's a tricky one, because Humboldthain stands right bang on the S-Bahn. We talked about the S-Bahn ring, and that's where it stands. And the worry is that when you blow up the entire bunker, this will also affect the S-Bahn, so the ring. And now we need to understand we're already in the Cold War scenario, because the bunker itself stood in the French occupation zone. The S-Bahn ring was Soviet controlled. So they thought, if we blow this up, this is going to cause a diplomatic incident. So they basically, and then cut long story short, they blew up half of it. The other half is still there. You can still visit it today, and it's huge. It's really, really imposing. You have guided tours in there, and it's a fascinating place to go. That was a very long introduction to the history of the bunkers. But actually what happens is, exactly as you said, because these got these big guns, and these are the only guns that the Germans had not taken out of Berlin and taken to the Oder front in April 1945. All the other aircraft guns are gone, but these are still here. And as the Soviets arrive, and they're trying to fight their way through, so they arrive from the northern sector in this part. So they're coming through onto Humboldthain, through basically the northeastern parts of Berlin, and then they hit the Humboldthain, where you have the tube station, the S-Bahn station. There's a bridge which is still intact at that particular stage, because the Germans are still using it to march across. And as they approach this bridge area, which opens up a little bit because it's a bridge and there's the tube station. It's not a huge square, but like a little square. They come under very direct fire from the German flag tower, which is only a couple of 100 meters away. The Germans also launched a big infantry counterattack across the bridge. They managed to get onto the other side of the bridge. They managed to seize about 1 or 2 blocks of houses. Then they are shot up by Soviet troops who bring forward reinforcements. And as we said in the previous episode, they're also using now self-propelled guns and direct fire rolls to try to blow away at these houses that the Germans have occupied. The Germans then withdraw, and it comes to a bit of a stalemate. One of the nasty episodes that you find is that in that ditch where we've got the S-Bahn, you still have foreign workers. So these are Italian prisoners of war. When Italy switches side in 1943, the Germans take prisoners of war. They bring them to Berlin to build the bunkers, and they are left there. Because the Germans say, well, you're prisoners of war, we don't care. We've got to look after our own people. They were not allowed to get into the bunkers, into the shelters, so they're trying to hide. And of course, quite a few of those die during the fighting for the Humboldt-Hain Flak Tower. What you then get is, and when you go into the Humboldt-Hain, you can see it's quite interesting. You have a number of windows cut into the bunker, which is a bit silly. I'll talk about this in a minute. And one round, an armor-piercing round by a Soviet self-propelled gun, is managed to fire through the small window. It's still stuck on the other side of the bunker on the inside. Why do you put windows into a bunker? I mean, that's a bit stupid, isn't it? Because you undermine the structural defensive value. Well, the idea was that the Nazis had already planned for the post-war scenario in which they wanted to use these bunkers as, for whatever. I think some were supposed to be used as offices, some as representative buildings of the Nazi regime. So that weakens the structure, of course, a little bit. You've got all these in there, but there you are. But that's the only thing that the Soviets managed to achieve. So put this one round in there. They keep firing at the whole thing. They even bring in a bit of air. They've got artillery fire and direct fire, but the concrete is so thick that there's nothing they can do. When you read some of the accounts from the Germans who are in that bunker, they say sometimes it was like the whole bunker was shaking because the artillery fire that gets direct fire onto it is so heavy. But the walls stand. And it's really interesting that this particular bunker remains in German hands all the way till the end of the fighting, till the 2nd of May. The Soviets are not able to seize that particular bunker. And it's only after the fight is already over, and of course there's the message by Weiding which says, well, everyone surrenders. That bunker still holds out. So that's probably, that must be a lie, that can't be true. And it's only when someone with a white flag appears and says, no, this is true, this is the message, well, fighting is over. This is where eventually on the 2nd of May, quite late in the day, the fortress, let's call it, the fortress of that particular bunker then also surrenders, and both the military, but also, of course, thousands of these civilians that had tried to find refuge in the bunker then finally come out. And with that fighting is over. So that's the Humboldt-Hain. We've got most of the fighting. The other two towers, they fall a bit more easily. They're seized by the Soviets during the fighting, but that one really does hold to the very end, which shows again the importance of these 3 flag towers for the fighting. And they are huge. You said Hamburg and Vienna. There you still have them in all there. Well, is glory the right word? You know what I mean? If that's the right word. They are huge.
In all their gloominess,
glory,
I would say.
glory.
They're very gray and very towering.
And they're big.
I used to live right next to one. I mean, every time I stepped out of my front door, there was a giant flag tower towering over me. It was very interesting.
Yeah, they're imposing on it because they're just so huge. And should you ever go to Hamburg or Vienna, well, make sure you have a look at them. The one in Hamburg is also interesting. It's just been turned into a very fancy hotel with a huge roof garden on the top, but that's a completely different story. But there we are.
One of the ones in Vienna is an aquarium.
Is it really? No, I did not know that. I just know,
Haus des Meeres.
I just know the one in this very fancy. What's the square called? The nice square where you got this huge flag tower in this very fancy square in Vienna. Which our friends live on that square, and I've been there last week. I forget the name of it though. There's one in the Augarten Park as well, which is a nice, very nice park. But I forget the name of the square. Anyway, but I always thought this square. I mean, we're moving away from Berlin for a moment, but that's a very strong political statement because, if I understand correctly, one of the nicest, poshest, fanciest square in all of Vienna, and then you build this huge concrete thing into the center of it. I mean, that is a statement by a government which calls itself National Socialist. So I mean, that's I think is quite clear. But anyway, return to Berlin. You can see how important these bunkers are. I mean, bunkers on the whole are important. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the whole bunker situation a bit later as well. But you also said the bunker program. So the Germans start this program. It's the biggest bunker building program in the world ever conducted, because they realized from 1940 onwards, really starts in 1942, that they're coming under the bombing rates and they need to build something. And the problem in Berlin is the water table is very, very high. So you can't really, in most places, you can't dig in deep enough. And this is why they built these towers. Easier and better to get into the ground, but it's very, very difficult.
Right. So on the topic of the towers, because they get used in the fighting because of the guns on top of them, right? As I mentioned, those guns can be lowered. And one of the famous instances where they're used is in the lead up to the assault on the Reichstag, which takes place between the 29th of April and the very end, the 2nd of May, because the remnants of the garrison only then surrender right at the end. They're stuck in the basement, basically, at that point. And what happens is you have the Soviet Third Shock Army. This is another one of these sort of famous examples of urban fighting. You have the Soviet Third Shock Army. They're coming down from the north, and they run into the Spree River. So if you think about, okay, what is this battlefield around the Reichstag? You have more or less running east-west the river. You have a couple of bridges over it, one of which is the Moltke Bridge, which is going to be the one that becomes more famous because of the fighting here. And then on the southern bank of the river, that's where you have the Parliament building, the Reichstag, a big open square in front of it, very big open space in front of it, called the Königsplatz at the time. And then on the other side of that, you have a couple of other buildings. You have some embassies, you have the Interior Ministry building, and then you have this opera house that you've mentioned before, the Kroll Opera House. So what the Soviets need to do in order to fulfill this political order they've been given to capture the Reichstag and have all the photo ops or whatever by May 1st, International Workers' Day, they've got to get across the river. However, that's not going to be very easy. So it ends up that they focus on trying to cross the Moltke Bridge. They try to cross it under supporting artillery fire because they have a lot of artillery that they've lined up, well, wherever they could fit it and wherever it was more or less safe to do so on the northern bank of the river. They're pounding all these German positions that are in the diplomatic buildings, in the Reichstag, and they've also dug some trenches, and there's like a construction ditch in this square in front of the Reichstag. And they're pounding them, and they try to get infantry across this Moltke Bridge, which you can visit today, by the way, and which still bears the scars of the fighting. There's like little chips out of it. It had these 4 little kind of gargoyle statues on the corners of the bridge. Now they've been replaced, but there's an original one. If you go down right next to the water, you can see an original one that's kind of all been half shot away from the fighting. So there are several attempts to cross the bridge, and one of those attempts fails because of the fire coming from this flak tower that's located at Zoo, and you have these huge 128 millimeter shells crashing in. They take out a tank. According to Soviet accounts, obviously it's a very confusing situation. And so the Soviets then finally get across. They storm the buildings on either side. Now they've got to take the opera house, they've got to take the Interior Ministry and the embassies. They manage to do all these things, but time is ticking, right? So every day that goes by or every hour that goes by means they might get in a lot of trouble from Stalin if they don't have the banner up there by May 1st for this symbolic kind of victory. So they are pushing, and they're not worried too much about the casualties that they are taking. And they assault right over the open space in the middle of the square, which is extremely difficult to do, and they don't make it very far a couple of times. There's a very touching letter written by a Soviet soldier. He's in the more or less in or in a trench in front of the opera house. The way he writes the letter, you can kind of gauge it. His name is Pereverzev, Vladimir. And he writes this letter basically saying, yeah, I can see it. You know, the Reichstag is there, and this is what we've been fighting for. So he's kind of absorbed that like propaganda message that this is, you know, the final boss or whatever. And he writes to his wife saying, you know, I can't wait to be back, and the garden and the homestead and all of that in Russia. And then, of course, he's killed in the following assault, which is quite. It's all the more sad when you can sort of see into his final thoughts before that happens. Anyway, in the end, the Soviet infantry does make it up to the Reichstag building. They blow out a window, start to get inside. There's all sorts of confused fighting there. If you're fighting if you've been in the Reichstag building, it's cavernous, right? It's a very large structure, long, big hallways. So very strange place to be fighting and firing machine guns and using grenades, hand grenades, and all this kind of thing. The Germans had bricked up, all the windows and sandbagged it. So it was quite a formidable building to try to take. They're fighting sort of floor by floor. The garrison, by the way, sometimes I've heard people say that it was these French SS defending the Reichstag, but that's not true. They were elsewhere. They weren't that far, but they were elsewhere. It was a mix of some regular troops, some SS, an SS company, and then a few, I think it was naval troops that were flown in at the last minute for the privilege of defending the Reichstag. In the end, what the Soviets do is as soon as they get control of a part of the building, they try to put a banner on top to fulfill this political obligation. But that doesn't work. It's not easy when you're under fire. You don't control the whole building. What do? The guy took his belt and tried to strap it up there. It's total confusion. At one point, they tried to drop one with an aircraft on top of it. At one point, a rumor goes up that the banner's there, and congratulations come from Zhukov to the 3rd Shock Army commander, but it's not true. So now in the Soviet system, you can't make a mistake, right? Because if they've said that the banner floats over the Reichstag, everybody's got to die to make that happen, basically. So in the end, the famous picture with the banner that you listeners and viewers have probably all seen is staged on May 2nd after the surrender by a photographer by the name of Yevgeny Khaldei. He found a couple of sergeants, I think it was, milling around and got them to pose for that famous picture. So a bunch of the Soviets who are involved in capturing the Reichstag get the Hero of the Soviet Union award. But it's a weird story, I find. All these desperate attempts to put a banner on top, all the crazy, weird fighting inside. They don't capture the whole building, as I say, until the general surrender on May 2nd. It becomes iconic in the Soviet memory of the war as well, just as the propagandists had intended, I guess, because there's a couple of war movies that feature this. There's a famous one from the 60s called Father of a Soldier, where you have a young Georgian soldier and who gets caught up in the war. He's conscripted. So then his father volunteers to join the Red Army, his older father, and they end up meeting each other for the first time in the Reichstag, fighting to capture the building. They don't say it's the Reichstag, but you can tell from the decor and the architecture. And they're talking to each other, yelling to each other, but they can't see each other around the corner while the fighting is going on. And then the son is killed, right? And so that's just one sort of cultural echo, I guess you could say, of the Reichstag battle. It's a very weird thing how the propaganda just made it into something, when in fact, militarily and politically on the German side, it's completely meaningless, essentially.
Absolutely. When you talk about the Reichstag and everything you've just explained, I think two things that are important as well. So when you go to the Reichstag today, you can still find the Soviet graffiti in the basement. I mean, that is quite a strong statement. Just imagine, so because the Reichstag is now again the seat of German parliament, and in this place, you still have the graffiti from 1945. I mean, that just sends out a very, very strong message, or different messages. You can probably choose which one it is, but it's quite stark. And of course, there's one thing, we talked about this, and I know how much you love this particular episode. So you have to talk about it, you have to mention it, and that's the watches. You can't get away without talking about the watches. I know how much you love it. Yes.
This drives me nuts. This is a personal pet peeve, and maybe some people out there will have political opinions about this or whatever. But yes, in the staged picture of the banner on the Reichstag, you can see that the Soviet soldiers are wearing watches, more than one. And so often in internet commentary, people focus on that, say, look, they're thieves, they were involved in looting. Watches were a prized thing. They were a desirable piece of loot for Soviet soldiers. So if they could loot a watch from a German house or apartment or whatever, many of them did. I feel, though, that to focus on that loses the historical importance of why that picture's taken, what's the story behind it, what's the experience of Soviet soldiers and the Soviet population during the war. The Red Army is not the only one that loots in the war. Of course, it doesn't mean I think it's good that they looted, obviously not, but looting is a common thing in warfare. And maybe I'm making too much of a big deal of it because, I work online with YouTube and with this podcast, but I have to say, I feel like we're missing the historical takeaway by focusing on those watches. So think about that, folks. The next time you look at that picture, think about, if you're interested in the watches and in Soviet looting, think about, what is it connected to? What else is there besides that story? Or, poverty is also, for example, a motivation in looting, right? They didn't only loot watches, they looted cloth, they looted women's underwear so they could send it to their wives. They looted pieces of glass, pieces of tin, and sent them back, right? So there's a context there, and there's another side to that I think is worth bearing in mind.
I just knew I had to mention this because you love that story so much. You can't get away with not talking about the watch. That's just the way it is. It's very true. I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? And I think in some ways you might say this whole attack onto the Reichstag just in the nutshell brings together the fighting for Berlin. So again, when you just take it back one step and you look at the fight for the Moltke Bridge, just again look at the numbers that are involved. On the German side, as you always say, we're not entirely sure. We've got the sailors there, a few SS guys. There are probably a few guys from about 100 from an NCO academy. So estimates are in that area at that stage about 1,500 Germans. Later on in the Reichstag itself, estimates go up to 2,000, but there are estimates, no one's really quite sure. When you look at the Soviet side, that's interesting because, again, they're using an entire corps. So that is 2 divisions that they have here to push through. And we talked a little bit about the numbers being low because they suffered casualties. So these divisions here under the 79th Rifle Corps are pretty much at full strength because on the way they found a number of prisoner of war camps where they had Polish guys in there. They just took them out, gave them a rifle, put them back into the lines. How combat effective they are, I think, is a completely different matter. But at least on paper, this is strong. And when you then look at the tactical situation on the ground, it's completely mind-boggling. Particularly when you compare that to what, for example, might happen today. So you've got this bridge in front of you. So you're the Soviet, you're coming in from the northeast, roughly speaking, where you now today find the new train station. So they fight their way through there. Then they swing round through an area called Moabit, that's what it's called, which, small tangent, housed Germany's most modern prison at that particular time. It doesn't exist anymore. It's a park now. Don't go there. It's not a particularly nice park. Should you have seen the films or read the books Babylon Berlin, this is where Charlotte Richter grows up because her father was employed by Moabit prison. I'm not quite sure why this is relevant. It's not. It's just because it's there. So it's thought about this. And so this is where they get on the 28th of April, the Soviets. And it's really interesting because you just opposite the Moltke Bridge on the northern bank, let's say it's about 200 meters away, you've got a building. It's an old customs building. And between the bridge and that, you also got a very nice beer garden that exists today. So if you want to go there and get some refreshments while in Berlin, that's where you should go. But this customs house building is interesting because it's about 200 meters away from the bridge. This is where Perevertkin, who is the Soviet Corps commander, puts up his headquarters. I mean, this, by modern day standards, is so completely unbelievable. Corps commander, 200 meters from the fighting of the division. And there's a story where it's actually, when the fight is not going all that way, where it's actually leaning out of the window, half shaven, because it was the morning he was about to shave, and basically shouting at the troops who are fighting their way across the bridge as a Corps commander. I mean, that's just, by modern day standards, completely unimaginable. But
it's the opposite of like the Chateau General's idea,
basically,
right?
that's exactly what it is. And But you can see that he gets very agitated and slightly annoyed, to put it mildly, because the fighting is not going well. So they get there on the afternoon of the 28th. They're trying to take the bridge. The Germans manage to hold them. They bring forward armor as well. The Germans have barricaded the southern end of the bridge, so they managed to drive a number of tanks onto the bridge and to the area of the bridge. This is where the flak tower comes in, knocks out these tanks, and this attack stalls. The Germans, realizing we don't need this bridge anymore, we're not going to launch this massive counterattack at night, try to blow it up. What happens is they put the explosives there, the bridge goes up, comes down again, and only one half of it, and not so that's basically it's the northern part, so to speak. So you can still cross the southern bit of it. So right, northern bit, no, so the western part collapses, the eastern part of the bridge still stands, so you can still cross from north to south. So it hasn't really worked. It makes it more difficult for the Soviets to cross it, but they can still cross the bridge if they want to. And then they begin to fall back because the Soviets then manage to get across. They fight their way across the bridge. There's another German counterattack which stops the Soviets for a while. But in the end, these two divisions, the 150th and 171st, manage to get across. And as you already explained, they then fight their way into this area. You also then have a third division which comes forward. That's the 207. That swings kind of to the right, fights its way into the Kroll Opera. And the 150th into the House of the Interior, it's called, sometimes also called the Himmler House on the bridge, basically. Then onto the Königsplatz that you already talked about. And the 171 moves into the diplomatic quarter, which basically means they get across the bridge and take a left turn. The diplomatic quarter at that stage is interesting. Even when you go there today, you will see it's pretty empty. There is not much. The one building that you still see today there is the Swiss embassy, because that was also the embassy that was not really that much. Well, it was destroyed and knocked about a bit, but they're also the only embassy that decides to stay there after the wall goes up or after the partition of Germany. All the others go. Some of them had actually been moved beforehand, and that's what some people don't realize. Most people think, well, all this was destroyed during the fighting or during the bombing. No, it wasn't. The most of the diplomatic quarter of Berlin, the old fancy part of town, was actually demolished by the Germans themselves, because this was all part of the great restructuring of Berlin to turn it into the capital of the world, Germania. And this is exactly the spot where the People's Hall would have stood, which you might have heard of it, which had been so big that it could have held 250,000 people, which would have created their own climate in there, which basically means probably lots of sweaty rain coming down on you. Not a very nice thought, but there we are. So this is why it was dismantled and relatively open, so far more open than it would have been in up to the early 1930s. Still quite a few houses, most of them get dismantled afterwards, but then they fight their way onto the Reichstag, as you explained. And again, there are lots of different stories. I mean, one story I once heard, and I don't really know whether that's very true or not, because you mentioned the bricked up entries to the Reichstag, and there's some German accounts from a Hitler Youth guy who was used as a runner, and he said that it was only the left part of the building that was defended. The right part of the building, that's where you had the dressing station and the kitchen, because that's where he would go to get sandwiches between his jobs. Whether it's true or not, I'm not entirely sure. Don't know exactly how this all played out. But there is this one story, and again, not quite sure if it's true, but you can see it in some of the Soviet accounts, that when they were trying to break their way into the Reichstag, of course, the best way to do that is with mortar fire. Because mortar fire goes up and comes down again, but you want to use this in a direct fire role, because direct fire onto this brick. So apparently, what they then did was, well, they chose a very lucky volunteer who was asked to hold the mortar against his belly and fire the round, then to die of internal bleeding or whatever afterwards. I'm not entirely sure that's true, but I've read this before. You can take different views on this, if it happened or not happened, while you tell the story, because of the heroism, willing to sacrifice yourself for the motherland, or whatever it is. But it's just one of these stories. You just get part of this whole myth around this fighting, you might say. What we do know is, because that is from the official Soviet accounts, as far as you can trust and believe them, that the Soviets used 86 guns in a direct fire role to soften up what the term is, the German defenses in the Reichstag. So 86 guns firing away at the Reichstag in a direct fire role. I mean, that is quite something, including some really large calibers. That's a lot of firepower going onto one particular building. And as you already explained, then you've got the fighting, and then in the end, the Germans surrender, and all this, you talked about this. And, of course, you get the watch incident. But I always think this just again looking at these sheer numbers. I mean, that's just absolutely crazy and mind-boggling. And again, you might ask the question why. You could have that wasn't important. The building wasn't important for the Soviets. We've talked about this many times about this riddle, what you might say, why the Germans keep fighting, and all this. So it's quite another interesting episode.
Indeed. Now, do you have another military example for us? Because as we said, we're not going to go brick by brick through the whole city. We've had now a couple of examples. We had the Humboldt-Hain flag tower and how difficult it was for the Soviets to capture that. We talked about the Reichstag, the difficulty of crossing a bridge and then crossing an open space facing a big reinforced building. If you've got another one, I'm all ears. If you don't, I'd like us to say a few words about the civilians' experience during all of this.
Or maybe a very short one, because you just mentioned again which areas we've looked at and what the emphasis was. And we haven't really talked too much about command and control at this particular level. And there's one relatively interesting episode. It's on the second line of defense, so at the S-Bahn ring in the meatpacking district. And you've got a police unit that is lined up there, and they're pretending to be some sort of military people. They've got rifles, but that's pretty much it. And they're supposed to defend the southern bank of the S-Bahn ring. So it's like a ditch there, and that's in the meatpacking district to the northeast of Berlin. And what is quite interesting, so they established a defensive position waiting for the Soviets to arrive to attack them. They then get reinforcements, and they get support from a Volkssturm, so this militia that we talked about many times before, a Volkssturm unit, and they're coming from Siemensstadt. Siemensstadt is to the north, the northern part of Berlin. This is part of the industrial part of the city, so there's a lot of industry in Berlin in 1945. And because they come from this industrial part which in those days is also producing a lot of weapons, this Volkssturm unit is probably the best equipped Volkssturm unit in all of Germany at that particular stage. And these guys are sent to this area as well, to the northeast of Berlin, to face the Soviets as they get there. And when they arrive, there's a big dispute between the Volkssturm and the police commander, because, well, each think that they should be in command. The police saying, well, we're the police. The Volkssturm saying, but we come under Goebbels. He's the Gauleiter. He obviously is more important than the police person. So you can see all of these interesting problems that you find. In the end, they come up with some sort of compromise in which it is said that the Volkssturm guys are going to take over one sector of this particular front line, and the police take over the other sector. When the police guys wake up the next morning, they are very, very surprised that they're getting shot at from the north, because they think that's where the Volkssturm people are. What they then realize is that during the night, the Volkssturm had got orders from the political line, so through Goebbels and Goebbels' office, who thought that they were commanding, or insisted they were commanding the Volkssturm. They'd ordered them to go somewhere else. So they just packed a Panzerfaust and walked off in the middle of the night without actually telling the other guys who were supposed to be defending the sector with them. And that opens up this front, and this is where the Soviets can then push in, fight their way through, and quite quickly then round up and destroy this police force. A lot of the Volkssturm guys end up a bit further to the north in the area called Prenzlauer Berg, the Schultheiss brewery, which in those days was the largest brewery in the world. There we go. So maybe they had at least a couple of happy days with a few drinks before they got all arrested by the Soviets. But that was the largest brewing complex in the world. But that's a completely different story. So again, it's just interesting when you look at, we talked about this earlier, how this command and control completely collapses and who's actually in charge. And you've got all these different command structures and links there. And that's a very, very good example of this. It's a fascinating episode. When you go there and you have a look at this, you can actually follow the tactical examples through if you really want to. It would be a bit too much now to talk you through every single platoon on the ground, but I think the command structure is a really, really interesting little aspect, and that works quite well in this example.
And beer leads me back to the civilian topic, actually, because we want to take a couple of minutes here to think about the civilian experience while all of this fighting is going on. That's part of the breakdown, in a way, of what's happened, because this chaos exists, of course, for civilians as well. The Nazi authorities are not able to provide shelter, food, the basic necessities. So what you have is some people, and actually this is also military as well, because I've read lots of accounts, even in Hitler's bunker, but also at like barracks, of people just knowing that the end is coming. And it's sort of, your chances of living are not what you would want them to be. So people were getting drunk, soldiers were getting drunk, people were having sex with each other. There's all sorts of accounts of, they had these like women volunteers for the SS at the end, and some of them got involved in all sorts of drinking and sex activities with other soldiers. And it's quite a weird, sort of apocalyptic environment for a lot of people. As for regular civilians out in the streets, obviously it's a terrible thing when there's fighting going on all around you. Some of the things that jump out at me from the accounts are the tensions between German civilians and German soldiers. Because there's a great memoir about the battle by a German soldier who was very young at the time, 17 years old. Helmut Altner is his name. And he basically says, a lot of the civilians hated us at this point because we were the cause of their suffering, in the sense of, why are you still fighting? If you would just stop fighting, this whole thing would just end. And that's what the civilians wanted more than anything else, or at least most of them. And there were cases that I've read where you'll have civilians hiding somewhere in a cellar or in a bunker or whatever, in a shelter, and German troops, are retreating or are being shelled, and they want to get in, and the civilians don't want to let them in. They want to try to keep them out because, for one thing, they worry that if the Soviets then show up and there's a mixed group in there, that everyone's going to get shot or everyone's going to be schlepped off to captivity in the Soviet Union. So the basic order of life starts to break down, which is not unique to Berlin, but it's a kind of a compelling example of that. The conditions as well in a lot of these shelters were unbelievably bad. Like the accounts from inside of the flak towers or in the shelter, the big bunker under the train station called Anhalter Bahnhof, which doesn't really exist anymore. There's one little arch left of the ruins, but it was a huge, huge train station at the time. They're awful. I mean, people stuck down there for a long time, not sanitary conditions. So people doing the things that nature requires us to do in their thousands or hundreds in a cramped space is absolutely awful. People dying of thirst or wounds or what have you, and just lying there and in the crowded bunker with people who are alive next to them, and it's just unimaginable. So these are some of the things that I also think about when I think about the Battle of Berlin. And then, of course, and we've talked about this before, so I don't want to spend too long on it, but I think we need to put it on the table as a part of the Battle of Berlin, is, of course, assaults against women, primarily by Soviet soldiers. This is quite a well-known and infamous war crime that happens outside Berlin, but also inside. I think the estimates they have from surviving hospital records is that around 130,000 women in the city were assaulted by Soviet soldiers. Perhaps about 10,000 women committed suicide in Berlin, and you can probably imagine the reasoning for that is not unconnected to these crimes of assault against women. And to get a little bit of insight into what it was like to be a woman in the city, there are two reads that I thought were useful. They're not graphic because that's not what one did as a woman writing in the 1950s and 60s. But, the situation is clear. One is called A Woman in Berlin. It's been translated, Eine Frau in Berlin. There was even a movie made like maybe 15-ish years ago about it. And there's another one that I don't think has been translated. It's called Tage des Überlebens, so Days of Survival, by Boveri was her family name, a woman who'd been a journalist before the war. So yeah, obviously harrowing stuff. Some forced laborer women who the Germans had potentially assaulted before bringing them back to work in Berlin were then also assaulted by Soviet forces. So some Soviet citizens were even assaulted. So it's an absolute mess from the civilian point of view. German units blowing up warehouses full of food while civilians are trying to get at the food. Just a complete mess.
No, it is. It's absolutely awful, isn't it? And again, it's one of these things that we tend to overlook quite often. I think I say that very often. We talk about military history and fighting. We tend to concentrate very much on the fighting bit. But the moment the fighting is over, everyone stops to look at what happens. Everyone kind of loses interest. But this is not the end of the story, is there? There is a bit more that happens and that goes on. So and I think that's an absolutely good example. And just think about the long-term consequence of these things as well. I mean, absolutely awful.
No question. So civilian experience is a key one, I think, to keep in mind for any discussion of the history of warfare. In this case, of course, we're coming to the end of the episode today. We're coming to the end of the story of the battle. And one of the final acts of the semi-organized German military is simply to try to escape. And there are several famous/infamous attempts. I don't know, Matthias, do you want to kind of summarize them for us?
All right, so just think about the situation. You're sitting in Berlin and you know that basically it's over, isn't it? So people are trying to get out as early as possible. That's not possible for everybody. Some of the gold pheasants that you mentioned earlier managed to get out. We talked about Hermann Göring, of course, who's down there somewhere in Bavaria, doesn't really come to Berlin. Himmler gets out relatively not early on, so he's still there for the 20th of April for Hitler's birthday thing. And then he decides that he needs to go and conduct the war from somewhere else. So people try to get away. Some people actually do get in as well. You have Hannah Reitsch, for example, the famous pilot. She flies in with a chap called Ritter von Greim. A very, very famous story. So in a small plane, they land on this artery that runs through Berlin, close to the Brandenburg Gate, now called the Street of the 17th of June. They get hit by Soviet anti-aircraft fire. He's heavily wounded in the leg. She then basically leans over and lands the plane. They're taken to Hitler in the bunker. He is made, so Greim is made head of the Air Force because he's so heroic. So people are trying to get in. Most people, because
he's half dead, but
exactly,
okay, he's the head of the Air Force for a day or two.
But yeah, exactly. Probably not pensionable after a day or two, but there we are. But most people, if you're sensible, you're not trying to get in, you're trying to get out. The problem, of course, is while Hitler is still alive, that's a bit difficult. If you're part of his entourage, that makes it difficult. Otherwise, and we talked about it in other episodes, it's also difficult because you don't want to be arrested by these flying courts, as they call them, and put up on a lamppost. So, but let's concentrate on Hitler and his entourage because that's the famous story. So most of them are basically just staying there. And they're staring a bit like the hare at the snake staring at Hitler. What's going on? Everyone's kind of waiting for something and get the green light, get out. Or they know once he's dead, they can get out. So and in the end, what happens is just before Hitler kills himself, he tells people, you know what, yes, okay, you can get out. Everything's lost anyway. There's no need for you to stay here. Some people decide to stay with him and kill himself. Burgdorf and Krebs, for example, the two generals. Who are also famous because they were involved in arresting Rommel and telling him to take poison. So they are there. They shoot themselves in the bunker. But most of the other guys try to break out. Now, how do you break out from a city like this? It's burning. There is still fighting going on. You're surrounded by the Soviets. So what they do is they split up into small groups, different sizes, between 5 and 10 and 15 people. They're actually having a chat with Hitler about this, how to get out, what's the best way to get out. And apparently one of the guys writes afterwards, he suggests that you should get down to the river and then take a boat and a barge and sneak out. And so you've got all sorts of different ways. So they normally have a couple of people who know Berlin quite well, who try to get the groups out. Cut a very long story short, because otherwise if we talk about all these groups, we'd be here forever. Only a handful of people get out, not many. One of them is his secretary, Traudl Junge, who wrote also the book about her time in the bunker, which was the basis for the film Downfall. So she manages to escape after all sorts of interesting episodes during this escape route. But most of the groups are actually either captured by the Soviets or actually killed. And a number of groups, a number of individuals are killed as they're trying to make their way across the Weidendammer Bridge, which is a bridge in central Berlin, from the southern bit of the center to the north, where they're trying to get to the northern part, then somehow get probably to Flensburg, where the Germans still were. And they get shot up on that bridge. You've got a couple of groups who are trying to escape through the underground system. So you talked about this earlier. We don't spend a lot of time talking about the underground and subterranean stuff that goes on. Famous episode as well where the SS blows the canal to flood the tunnels. That also happens. But most of them die. And probably the most famous, infamous, talked about episode is where you've got Martin Bormann, who is the grey eminence of the Third Reich. So he's Hitler's private secretary. He basically controls Hitler very much towards the end. And he tries to break out as well. And he goes missing. And no one knows where he is. And the usual story is in Argentina. Is he here? Is he there? Where is he? Does he live in a remote village somewhere in Brazil with Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe, and they all live heavily together? Who knows? Lots of confusion. One thinks, he gets sighted here, now suddenly he's there, and suddenly he's in Buenos Aires or whatever. It's only later on, a couple of decades later, when they're doing work close to the main train station in Berlin, which, by the way, if you are not from Berlin, you will call the main train station or the main station. But if you are a good old Berliner, you would call it Lehrter Bahnhof. Exactly. No one, everyone I know still calls it Lehrter Bahnhof, not the main station. That's just for the people who don't know Berlin. You get that everywhere, don't you? But it's the Lehrter Bahnhof. And so they're doing some sort of work there in relation to the train station. And they find two skeletons there. And they then look into the files, and they again look at some of the testimonies of where Martin Bormann was last seen. And that was very, very close. It's not far from the Weidendammer Bridge. And he's identified. They take his dental records and all of this. And he's identified, so we now know that he died there. And they also find little glass splinters. So basically it took cyanide capsule, bit it, and he was dead. So he's gone, we know this now. And of course, there was one other person who was also there. That's a chap called Stumpfegger. And Stumpfegger is a medical doctor. He's in the SS, but he's a medical doctor. He's at the very end, one of Hitler's physicians. But he's also well known in a very, very bad way for another episode that takes place, because he is the guy who's in the bunker, and he plays a role when it comes to the end of the Goebbels family, in particular the children. And I know that you know that story very well, so I'm going to throw it back to you.
Well, yeah, it's not a feel-good story, obviously, but Goebbels and his wife Magda, they decide they're not going to try to leave Berlin. They're not going to try to break out. But they have a lot of kids. I think they have 6 kids, if I'm not mistaken. And they decide they're not going to send the kids out either, but everybody's gonna end everything there. So what they do is essentially, they have the kids poisoned and killed, and then they take poison themselves. I guess there could be more details. I don't feel like spending my day talking about the details of how they ended their children's lives, but you can just see the degree of where their minds are at. It's completely beyond what's normally human in any case. So that's one of the most tragic things, because you can say that Hitler deserved it. You can say that Goebbels deserved it. It's pretty hard to argue that those kids, deserve the fate that their parents decided to give them. It's an absolute, moral condemnation, I think, of them as parents and as the whole political system that would lead to that being the desired solution.
No, absolutely right. I mean, that's just harrowing, isn't it? Absolutely awful. Very, very true.
So as far as Hitler is concerned, he marries Eva Braun on the 29th. They commit suicide on the 30th. Yes, folks, they commit suicide. I know there's a lot of rumors. There's supposedly a black and white picture of somebody who looks like him in Argentina later. There was a documentary on the History Channel called Hunting Hitler that played with the language to maybe leave it open that he might have gone to Argentina or whatever. There's no credible evidence that he went to Argentina, and there's a lot of evidence that he shot himself in that bunker in Berlin. There's dental records, there's testimony of people who disposed of the body. He himself is on record saying he would stay and do it. There's no credible historian who's written that he didn't do it. I mean, from Hugh Trevor Roper in the mid-1940s to, what's his name, Daily Graves, Luke, who just published a book in detail about it a few years ago. He killed himself, folks. Just that's the way it is. And his body was brought out into the garden of the chancellery above and burned. And there are records of like Rokus Misch discussing about the burned body, and he wrote a memoir afterwards. So that is the deal. I can only, in respect to whatever other theories there are, I can only quote Hugh Trevor Roper, who wrote the first big book about the final days of Hitler. Reason is powerless against the obstinate love of fiction. So if you really want to think he went to Argentina, it's just because you love a great story, not because you're following the historical evidence. Let's put it that way. So that's another chapter to the end of the Battle of Berlin.
Evidence, schmevidence. There we go. That's all I can say to that.
Right,
That's all I can say to
Who
that.
needs
Exactly.
that anymore?
When you then look forward, it's awesome. I mean, where do we stop with this? I mean, again, we could go on now forever. We've all been talking for about an hour now, I think. But the whole, of course, then his body gets taken out. It's burned there in the garden of the Reichschancellery, which is then turned afterwards into basically it's a parking lot. That's what it is. And I remember going there in the very early days, my early days, and people didn't even know. I didn't want to know. When I walked around there looking for stuff in the center of Berlin, doesn't get more center than this. People were thinking I was trying to nick their cars, break into the cars. That's where it all went. It was only in 2006, I think, if I remember correctly, for the Football World Cup, I think that was in Germany at that stage, that they decided to put up this board, which you can see there now, because they knew that every international person coming to Berlin wanted to see the Hitler bunker, which of course doesn't exist anymore. So that was all completely dismantled by the East German regime in the 1980s. So not much remains of either Hitler nor the bunker, but there we are. That's the end of that particular story. When he's dead in the 30s, of course, we then have, you still have the fighting going on. The fighting isn't over in Berlin. And it's only when then Weitling, we talked about, and the commandant of the defense of Berlin, or the Fortress Berlin as it was called, of course he hears of this, and then they start the negotiation with the Soviets. But even before that, Goebbels had sent across an emissary, because Goebbels takes over for a day or so as the Reichschancellor. So he sends out people, and again, that's an interesting story. So there's a chap von Dufling who is being sent out. You then have, you've got other guys, Krebs goes there, and he is fluent in Russian because it served as the defense attaché to Moscow before the war. So you can see there's all sorts of negotiations, and particularly Goebbels still trying to get some concessions, which is really when you just think about it. So they're knocking on your door. They're about 100 meters away from the bunker, and you're still trying to reason with the Soviets. It's just, the whole thing is just ridiculous. I mean, the whole thing is also quite interesting because the Dufling gets there and says, well, you know, Hitler is dead. And of course, Chirkov pretends he knows all of this. It's a funny story. So he was sitting in his little room in the headquarters close to Tempelhof, and they said, well, here's this German guy. So someone, because he's too junior, one of the Soviet officers is told to hide in a cupboard because we don't want to have a junior lieutenant here when the grown-ups talk, so you just disappear. And he mentions that later on in the memoir. So there's all sorts of stuff still happening. But in a nutshell, on the 2nd of May, the fighting is done over, the German surrender. And the wording of that document is also interesting because Weitling kind of puts the blame on Hitler and says, well, on the 30th, Hitler has killed himself. And he basically says something along the lines of, well, with this, he's betrayed you, you as faithful soldiers. You're no longer bound by your oath because he's dead, and that's a personal oath. And now it's time to make peace to stop the suffering of the civilian population. Something along those lines. So that's and that basically then brings the Battle of Berlin to an end. But only the fighting, of course, and then we enter the next stage, which I think I've now said a number of times, we don't really tend to look at. But of course, life doesn't stop on the 2nd of May, 1945. If you are from Berlin, in many ways, it's just as bad, perhaps even worse for the next few days, weeks, months, and what have you. And it's only then from the late 1940s that things really start to improve. So it's still a pretty nasty period, nasty time ahead of you. In addition to the normal suffering of the population, of course, you also get this whole political dimension with the Western Allies arriving in the summer of 1945, the division of Berlin, all these things that fall out of the end of the Third Reich. I mean, that of course, as we all know, is a million different episodes, some of podcasts, and we stop in 45. So not for us to do that, but there we are.
Yeah, a battle, an event that had an impact on the world in a way, politically, and also on the city that goes, far, far beyond its pure military dimension. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've ended up spending now 6 episodes, the last of which is a bit of a bonus, extra long one, to try to do it some justice, to try to give you folks out there a little bit of insight beyond there was, dramatic fighting in the city and there's Hitler in a bunker and stuff like that. It's a huge historical event. It still shapes the city today. And that's why we thought it was worth spending quite a few episodes on. So, are we ready, Matthias, to wrap it up? Shall I?
That feels strange now, doesn't it? After all this time we spent on Berlin.
It does. Yeah. It's like losing an old friend.
Very true.
So, folks, in the course of the last 6 episodes, we've taken you from the preparations for this operation all the way to the fighting in Berlin itself, the political implications, the impact on civilians, the escape attempts, hopefully debunking the conspiracy theories that go along with it. And we hope you've had a valuable experience and enjoyed yourself and learned something along the ride. If you want to support us in this kind of work for the next mega series about one of the more important campaigns in the Second World War, by all means, you can become a supporter of the podcast. You can do that by visiting our website at bothsidesofthewire.com. You can even get access to exclusive content there in our war room. You can try that out for a free trial by using the code word Deep Dark Woods. Otherwise, I am exhausted, folks. That is it for our Berlin series for now. Who knows? Maybe we'll revisit a certain theme or a certain aspect in the future. But for now, that was our Mega Berlin series, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. Recording time, everybody.
Don't know where that came from, but there we go.
Chicken is counting down the minutes until his head gets chopped off, I guess.
There we go.